Okay, so where we last left off, we were about to start bringing in all of these different parameters that we'd already defined, and we're going to see what happens when we vary these parameters during the simulation and analyze their impact on the overall economic activity taking place. All right, so we have the rate of spending, the rate of tax. Okay, I like to have taxing and then spending. All right. Okay. Even though it goes in the opposite order, I just like to have it laid out like this. So I'm going to copy all of those parameters, drag them down into my control panel down here where all of my control parameters are. I'm going to just paste them right here where they're nice and comfortable. All right. And before we begin the simulation, we'll just check out what the original settings are. So right now, the government isn't doing any spending, it's not doing any taxation, the Fed is not purchasing any bonds, and because there's no deficit, no bonds are being issued, and there is, and there's no, whatever bonds that are already held are not paying any interest. Okay. One more thing, actually, before I start, because we say that there's an initial stock of 0. So one thing that I'll do here, just to help with the illustration, is I will define some initial amount of bonds held by the public sector, or excuse me, by the private banks. So let's say that the private banks hold, I don't know, 50 billion in treasuries, okay? And that means that the TGA has 50 billion in reserves in its checking account, all right? And so right now its equity is 0, it's completely balanced, all right? And everything is good. But now we also have to come over to the balance sheet of the private banks and just make sure that their equity reflects the bonds that they now have on their balance sheet. Just come over here to my initial conditions, right? So this needs to be balanced. So the reserves held by the banks, so there's 50K, or excuse me, 50 billion in bonds held by the banks, all these other deposits as well. So I need to bump up my equity by 50, which is over here. So I'll bump up my equity by 50 to where now 80, all right? And now everything is balanced. Cool. So now that all of that is done, let me go ahead and refresh this. Okay, everything is balanced. Looking good, looking good, looking good. All right, so we'll come down here back to our charts. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to note what are the current settings. All right, so the rate of lending in the private sector is taking place at the same rate as repayments of the private sector. So there's going to be no net money creation through debt creation in the private sector. All right, and there's going to be no net money creation through the deficit spending of the public sector. All right, and again, so we just defined that the banks do have some initial stock of bonds on their balance sheet, but because those bonds are not paying any interest right now, according to our settings, they're not going to have any effect on the income stream of the bank's equity. All right, so let us go ahead and see what happens when we run this simulation. All right, essentially it's just a fully private economy because there's no government activity taking place. All right, and we saw that the economic activity is primarily driven by the rate of lending and repayment and the consumption taking place. Okay, so let's go ahead and drag this up just a little bit, zoom out just a little bit, and press play and see what happens. All right, so I'll pause it right here. Simulation has been running for 21 years, thereabouts, and we see that everything has come to a nice equilibrium. The equity of the banks and the equity of the deposit firms, the equity of banks and the deposit accounts of the workers and the firms have flatlined. Okay, everything is basically flatlined now. GDP is constant at just under 100 billion, it looks like, maybe 75 billion. All right, the growth rate is constant at basically zero. Money velocity is basically unchanging. Okay, basically just a stagnant economy. All right. So I'm going to keep letting this run and just see what happens when I increase the rate of lending in the economy. Okay. We can see that the GDP starts to pick up. The equity of the bank starts to pick up, which makes sense because they're issuing more loans. The deposits of the workers is going to pick up. That makes sense because the private firms are going to be paying their employees using they're going to be paying their employees out of their deposit accounts, right? Out of the same account that all of the rest of their financial assets are in, and they're paying their workers. They're paying their workers out of those deposit accounts at just some fixed rate of essentially a time constant, which determines how long it would take for the firms to spend all their money as wages to their employees. Okay, and so the more money that they have in those deposit accounts, the more money that they can afford to pay their workers. Okay, and so you see that the workers are making more income. All right, the profits of the firms is also increasing. Okay, let's see what's going on here. Okay, looks like the wages has actually stayed constant. If I let this play. Okay, well actually it is increasing ever so slightly. It's just, it just appears constant because of the scale of what's going on with the profits of the firms. All right. And now also we have that the private debt to GDP ratio is increasing, as it should, because only private lending is taking place, whereas the public debt to GDP ratio is decreasing because they're bringing in more revenue in taxes. All right. Well, actually, they're not bringing in any they're not bringing in any new revenue in taxes, but rather the GDP itself is just increasing. Okay, so the GDP itself is increasing, which is going to decrease the debt ratio, respectively. Okay, and we also notice that the M2 money supply is rising in tandem with the increased amount of loans taking place in the economy. Okay, and so we see the impact that debt creation has on overall economic activity is to stimulate economic activity. Okay, so now I'm going to decrease that rate of lending to bring it back in the same pace as the rate of repayment. All right, I'm gonna pause this guy. And now I'm going to consider, okay, so now what happens if the debtors start making repayments at a quicker rate than the lending is taking place? Okay, so I will keep running the simulation, and now I'll make the rate of repayment happen quicker. All right, and now you can see that the GDP has started to fall, the money supply has started to fall, income start to fall, everything starts to fall, okay? Because we're destroying money with the repayment of the loans. There's less money in the deposit accounts of the firms. That's less money that they can pay out as wages, less deposits to the workers' bank accounts, all right? And less financial assets being held by the bank, because every dollar being repaid to those debts is a dollar coming off of the asset side of the balance sheet of the private banks. Okay? And so in a credit economy, the primary mechanism through which economic activity takes place is that debt channel. Okay. So now I'm going to go ahead and press play and bring the rate of repayment and rate of lending back into harmony. And now we can contrast the behavior of that private lending, what with the behavior of monetary policy and fiscal policy, and we can see what is going to be the impact on the overall economy when we do that. All right. So remember, there's no net spending or no net taxes taking place in the economy right now. I am going to go ahead and assume that. So let's actually start from the beginning, and I am going to assume that we start with a balanced budget at first. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Just bring those to the same amount. So I'll say that there's a 3% taxation rate and a 3% spending rate. Again, doesn't really matter what these numbers are right now. Everything is going to be constant, and I just want to show for illustrative purposes what happens when that is the case. Okay. So we'll press play. We see we get the same kind of constant flat line as we did in the beginning, where the rate of lending and the rate of repayment was equal. All right, basically a stagnant economy. And so if the rate of taxation and the rate of spending, from the government is the same, we get this. We get the same feature. All right, basically a constant, kind of stagnant economy. All right, so I'm going to press play now. And now I'm going to let the government run a deficit by increasing the rate of spending 1 point higher than the rate of taxation, and boom, we can see that the M2 money supply starts to increase. Public debt holding starts to increase, right? Because we're running a deficit, and now bonds are being issued and purchased by the banking system. Okay. Interesting. We also have the equity of the banks is rising, right? Because they're getting that interest income from the bonds. The deposit accounts of the workers is rising. Okay. The incomes, or rather the profits of the firms is increasing. The debt to GDP ratio, the private debt to GDP ratio is decreasing because the private sector is getting more assets onto its balance sheet with no offsetting liabilities. However, the public debt to GDP ratio is rising, the mirror image of the private debt to GDP ratio falling. Okay. And we have that there are no purchases of the bonds from the banks by the Federal Reserve. The OMO parameter is still 0. All right. And as a matter of fact, what we should do is we also need to add an interest income. Okay, so we'll add an interest rate onto these bonds. All right. Actually, you know what? I want to show what happens as we increase that interest from 0 up to, let's say, 5%. Okay, so I'm going to let this play out a little bit more. We're going to run that deficit, increase the spending. Okay, and now we're going to increase the interest rate. All right, and we can see a great acceleration now in economic activity as that interest income starts to hit the deposit accounts of all the various entities in the economy. All right, so that's interesting. So now I'm going to balance the budget by reducing the rate of spending. Okay. But you can see, so let me do it one more time. Oops. So the line's going up, line's going up. Now I'm going to reduce the rate of spending to bring it back in line with the rate of taxation. So the budget is balanced right now, but the GDP is still increasing and the M2 money supply is still increasing because we have the interest channel. All right, we have interest income being paid to the banking sector, all right, which is going to increase the equity of the banks tremendously, all right? And it's also going to increase the, well, the fact that we had a deficit is what was increasing the deposits of the firms because the government was spending that money on the firms. And I just noticed the deposit account of the workers is still kind of off the scale here, so it still appears constant. All right. And so now what I want to do is I want to show what happens when the Federal Reserve starts to purchase those bonds from the banks. So I'll continue letting the simulation run here. And now I'm going to bump up the open market operations parameter. Bump it up, bump it up, bump it up. Oh, well, the budget is balanced right now, so let me, there you go. Let me start that over. Okay, so we're starting with the balanced budget, starting with the open market operations at 0. Okay, we will run the simulation starting with the balanced budget. Okay, so here is the balanced budget. Now we're going to run a deficit by increasing spending. Oh, well, right now you actually see, okay, so before I even do anything, you can see this is the impact of the interest channel, okay, of the interest payments on those bonds that are initially held by the banking system. Okay, so even though there's no new bond issuance, just the bonds that already exist on the books, all right, is generating interest income. So you can see GDP rising, private debt to GDP falling, and the M2 money supply increasing, as well as profits and incomes. All right. So now I'm going to increase the spending. All right. So there's going to be new bonds held by the banks, right? So the line is going up. And now I'm going to have the Fed start to purchase those bonds from the banks and see what happens. Okay, so we're going to increase the bonds being purchased by the Fed. And you can see that the bonds held by the Fed line is going up, and the bonds held by the banks, that line is coming down. All right, and eventually they will pass each other at some point. And if all of the bonds are being purchased by the Fed and none of the bonds are being purchased by the banks, all right, then you get this situation. The banks' bond purchases flatlines, Fed's bond purchases explodes, the public debt to GDP is falling very sharply, but as well as the private debt to GDP ratio, because the GDP is increasing due to the government spending. All right, it has a stimulative effect. Okay, so we can see that running a massive deficit while the Federal Reserve is purchasing the bonds, the only impact that it really has is that the public debt is shifted from the private sector to the public sector, which in effect reduces the public debt to GDP ratio. All right. Nothing else actually happens though. Money velocity unchanged, incomes, bank accounts, GDP, all of that is still rising due to the economic stimulus of the deficit. All right. So if you want to understand the effect that the Fed's monetary policy operations have on the overall economy, just in terms of the mechanics, they have essentially no impact on any of the, on any of the stuff that we really care about. The GDP, the, incomes, profits, how much money people have in their bank accounts. All right, all of that is unchanged by Fed policy. And the only thing that really changes is the public debt to GDP ratio, but it changes in the opposite way of what you might think with the media representation. All right, the Fed purchasing bonds doesn't explode the national debt or anything like that. You know, the debt monetization, right? It actually decreases the debt to GDP ratio. Okay, it takes it takes those bonds, it takes that public debt out of the private sector. Okay, and it just puts it onto the government's books, and you don't even factor that in. Okay, to the debt ratios. Moreover, the Fed can purchase all those bonds, right? But because the but because those bonds are interest producing assets of the banks, that's really taking away interest income from the banking sector. All right. So the the effect that it has is more pronounced though in these debt ratios in the public debt holdings. Okay. And so if you're one of the interesting conclusions that you can kind of take away from this is that if you're one of these people that really cares about the debt to GDP ratio, you really want the Fed to buy up all the bonds, okay? Because when the Fed buys all those bonds, just by nature of the accounting that's taking place, the debt to GDP ratio falls in accordance with the purchases. Okay. So I'll start this over, and I'm going to really quickly. I'm going to lower this interest rate down to a more reasonable number. Let's say 5%. Okay. And I'm going to reduce the deficit. All right. And I'm going to have that the Federal Reserve purchases all the bonds. Start the simulation. And we see that GDP is rising ever so slightly due to the interest income channel. Right? Private debt to GDP falling. Okay. M2 money supply increasing. Right? Now, let's say that we run a deficit, but look at that. Because the bonds held by the banks is not increasing since the Fed is purchasing them all, as soon as the bank buys them, the Fed purchases them from the banks, okay? The public debt holdings in the private sector stays flat. All right? And the debt to GDP ratio, the public debt to GDP ratio starts to fall. Okay, and my computer's going a little bit slow here because it's hard to run the simulation and record at the same time. But look at that. GDP rising, but the public debt to GDP ratio falling, even though we're running a deficit. And in fact, I can increase this deficit to where GDP really takes off, money supply really takes off, incomes really take off, bank accounts take off. All right. But the public debt holding is only exploding on the Fed's balance sheet, but who cares? The debt to GDP ratio is still falling. Okay? So I think that this is, a really useful way to kind of wrap your head around the impact that monetary policy has on the overall economy and contrast that with the impact that fiscal policy has on the economy. Okay, so we can see that fiscal policy truly is a stimulative mechanism, and the interest rate on bonds is a stimulative mechanism as well. But the Federal Reserve's purchases of those treasuries really has no impact whatsoever other than to lower the debt to GDP ratio, not increase it. Okay, and hopefully we also understand now the sequence of events, how it takes place, based off of how we defined it in the balance sheet back in the first video, where the government spends the money into the economy first, all right, and whatever money is remaining after taxation, the government just borrows against that money, right? That's already in the private sector, okay, and it's good. There's no threat that there won't be enough money in the economy to fund the deficit, because the deficit puts the money into the economy first. Okay, and the bonds are only there to, almost as an accounting trick, just to say, okay, yes, this is the money that we spent that we didn't tax back, and we're going to issue bonds, just as a kind of as a receipt that that's what happened, right? And of course, because of the nature of, of the legislation, we pay interest on those bonds. It's treated as a debt. But really, the government can run. There's nothing economically preventing the Treasury from running negative equity indefinitely. Okay, and funding all of this economic stimulus, right? Okay, so hopefully somebody learned something, and I answered Senator Lummis's question in a way that was a bit more clear, and illustrative. All right, so hope you all enjoyed that, and I will catch you in the next one.